Welcome to PCM Podcast, a series of informative podcasts with experts in their fields exploring a wide range of topics in payments. The theme for today's session is European payments in 2021. Who is holding all the cards? Amid the rising hype about mobile wallets, P2P FinTech challenges and QR code payments, this year's digital and card payments yearbooks shows a card segment in robust health. The new research by Digital and Card Payment Yearbooks shows the European card business is growing across the continent with strong regional hotspots. In fact, card payments are growing so much that even if the wildest projections regarding mobile wallets come to pass, wallets would still only account for around 5% of all electronic transactions by 2025. I'd like to introduce our expert of the day, James Wood. James is a previous editor of the Digital and Card Payment Yearbooks and is the current managing editor of Payments, Cards and Mobile. James, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Okay, we'll jump straight in. So James, there has been quite a lot of hype around wallets, but what's clear from the latest data in the market is that their dominance for the future of payments may have been slightly overhyped. What are your thoughts around the current state of the card payment market in Europe?
Well, it's clearly growing. There's been robust growth. If we look right up to the pandemic, we've got 3.817 billion trillion euros in terms of value across the continent, which is up more than 6.5% year on year. And if you compare, JP Morgan saying that to global wallet spend is going to be about 740 billion, of which there's probably estimated to be around 1.5 billion in Europe, which is quite small. You can see it's just a tiny fraction of the overall electronic payment spend in Europe. So I think cards are very much still the dominant payment instrument when it comes to electronic payments.
Let's just discuss some of the drivers around that. I mean, clearly the impact of contactless has really helped with this kind of dominance and a kind of card resurgence around payments. What are your views on the contactless data you have come across throughout Europe?
So what we're seeing is that contactless has rocketed, not just rocketed, but continues to during 2021. So our data for the 2021 yearbooks suggests that 85% of the terminal base across Europe is now contactless enabled. Since our data came out, really in the last couple of weeks, I've seen opinion data from certain industry outlets saying that contactless is responsible for between 80 and 90% of all in-person transactions. So all the signs are, if you look at Visa data from the US as well, where contactless growth has been slower, something like a quarter of US people are saying, I'm already using contactless in 60% of my transactions, and 24% are saying, and I'm going to use it more. So if anything, we're really seeing the end. What we are seeing the end of perhaps is chip and pin and the introduction of contactless. And of course, there's a bunch of interesting questions that come out of that about how do we secure contactless as the transaction limits increase. We've got the UK going up to £100 transaction limit on the 6th of April. So there's clearly some things around security for contactless transactions.
Sure. Okay. Well, look, we'll come to that in a bit. But I mean, actually, it's a good point you raise about these transaction limits going up. What is the possible impact? And we'll come to the fraud side later. But the possible impact now for contactless and card payments against wallets, now that we see the value that you can transact with a contactless card?
Well, I think it's all contactless transactions, so it includes wallets as well. But clearly, we're going to have an awful lot more usage of contactless. It's only going to increase the usage. So if I go out for dinner and the bill's £80 and I couldn't use a contactless card before, now I can. And so, from the 6th of April, I'm able to. And actually, the UK's led the world in this. I think outside the US, where there's no contactless limit, or in China, where there is solid digital ID, we've got the highest contactless limit in the world now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sticking with the card theme, before we move on to some other areas, it certainly seems like debit has been the big winner, and that credit is not growing across Europe as fast as it has. Is that likely to be a sustainable trend, or is that just COVID related and an interim trend?
Well, the evidence is that, first of all, you're right, that debit cards are growing faster than credit, almost twice the pace of credit. There are also, of course, far more debit cards than there are credit cards. What we're seeing is that the number of transactions per card is also going up. What this suggests is that people are now more comfortable using debit cards for everyday purchases. So for something as small as £2, £2.50, £5, people are using their debit card instead of cash, where they might have used cash before. And again, you can see the symbiotic relationship between the contactless and the debit. Yeah, so you've got contactless debit. It's far easier to use that card than it is to fish around for £5 or £10 or a €20 note and have to go to an ATM and all that stuff. So really, the two things are working in concert, and there's a lot more card transactions going on, principally through that contactless debit channel.
Okay, and in those sort of more credit-heavy markets, you and I have discussed this in the past, but what do we see as the trends in those more credit-heavy markets? Is it going to remain on the card, or do you see some of these more installment payments, Klarna or PayPal Pay in 3, or these types of solutions becoming more prevalent, or do you think it will return back to the kind of traditional credit card?
Well, credit products for a long time have been getting more expensive for banks to offer. And there was a study in the US last year that showed that the profitability of credit cards had halved in the last decade, principally because banks have been having to offer more and more incentives to consumers to use them. So that's one side of this. I think the other side of it, as you say, is the huge growth in installment payments. I just wonder if we haven't hit a bump in the road with installments, in as much as there's now pretty strong calls to regulate installment payments. And so it will be interesting to see. On the one hand, you've got the increased cost of running a credit card. On the other hand, you've got installments coming up on the outside lane, if you like, but now hitting a speed bump. And I think there's a third issue here, which is, what is the credit function for in a digital environment? So we've seen Apple launch a digital credit card. A digital-only credit card, excuse me. We've got the neobanks offering digital-only credit cards as well in places. But, if it's possible for you to get a line of credit and/or an overdraft and/or an installment product, suddenly you start to ask yourself, well, why am I going to pay 18.7% on a credit card?
Given the expense of those products, it'll be a very interesting area of the market. Some of those names, Klarna is less household, but PayPal is certainly a household name now. The fact that they've moved into those kind of installment payments markets, we know from our experience that the networks are certainly looking at some of those installment products, and even some of the hardware suppliers. Not naming names, but we've worked with a few clients on the hardware point of sale side that are also trying to introduce a kind of installment product at point of sale, at physical point of sale. So it'll be interesting to see how those products play out in the market.
Yeah.
We've talked a bit about the infrastructure. Let's move on to that. We talked around the card market from a user usage point of view, but we've not really discussed card acceptance from the point of sale point of view. What do you see as the key trends at point of sale for the next 12 to 18 months?
So, again, what we're seeing is continued growth in POS acceptance. And I think, again, you have to link this to the trends in contactless and debit. Okay, because as contactless debit becomes more prevalent, we're going to see electronic payment go into areas where you would previously have paid cash. So if you think about going to a rugby stadium or a football stadium, instead of paying for your snacks and drinks with cash, you're going to be able to do that with tap and pay. You've also got click and collect rising as well. So these factors have really just encouraged us to have more EPOS terminals, and that's reflected in the data from the most recent reports. The POS installed base grew by 8% in the most recent data in Western Europe. If you look at the figures for Southeast Europe and the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, which we also cover, as you know, we're talking about double-digit growth rates that we last saw in Europe, maybe Western Europe, maybe 20 years ago. So some of the opportunities out there, I know you and I talk about this a lot, but some of the opportunities in Eastern Europe for point of sale hardware terminal firms are stunning, frankly,
Yeah, I was going to mention, we talked about some hotspots. Any particular countries from the data that we covered that you particularly thought, wowzers, it's going gangbusters there. If I was into point of sale infrastructure or potentially card issuance as well, those would be the markets I particularly would be aiming my marketing budget at.
Yeah, so Romania, Bulgaria, the former Yugoslavian states, Ukraine, all of those, Russia as well. I think Russia had something like 40% growth in debit card usage. Phenomenal. And I think what's really interesting, Alex, and I sense we might be coming on to this next, but is the fact that as that base comes in, it's coming in as contactless enabled. Yeah. And it's coming in as multivalent in terms of the payment method acceptance. So, if I'm a small merchant chain in Eastern Europe, now is the time for me to really be upgrading or coming into electronic payment for the first time, because I can buy terminals now that accept wallet and that accept a wide range of other payment methods.
Sure. Okay. Just a quick one on that. I guess we're not only focusing on the growth of traditional black box point of sale, right? We're also talking about the ability to turn your iPhone or Samsung phone into an ePOS terminal. So is that where the growth is, or are you also seeing traditional point of sale boxes still experiencing that kind of growth?
Well, it's both, but it's an interesting point you make. The data point I'm going to give is from the United States. So I imagine typically this is a next trend which is only more exacerbated in Europe. But in last year in America, the debit transaction market, 20% of all the growth came from account-to-account transactions, which is seen as an alt pay. Okay, but those alternative payments are coming up fast. The problem is, I think one of the messages we want to get across is that wallets, alt payments, they are growing phenomenally quickly, but from a very small base. The same is true of the Chinese wallet giants. If you look at Alipay, WeChat, they're growing very, very quickly, but from a very small base. When you see a lot of hype, what's important to understand is that cards are still the dominant electronic payment method. And indeed, let's not forget, in those Eastern European markets I referred to, cash is still the dominant payment method. So there is huge headroom, still huge growth and reasons for optimism if we look at over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Yeah,
interesting. I also saw something around that in certain markets. Out in Asia, it's still, up at 70% for cash, so.
Japan, for instance,
Yeah, there's plenty of them. Okay, so I think we've touched on it, but I guess we simply can't talk about electronic, digital, card, mobile payments in general without raising the spectre of fraud. I know that you've been working on research around fraud for some of the features in the magazine. What about the kind of high-level key trends in fraud between the next 12 and 18 months?
Okay, so, the most recent ECB data that we have showed fraud on the rise, but that's actually going back to 2018. Since that time, what we've seen is an explosion of fraud in the digital channel. And I think certainly in most of Western Europe outside the Nordics, I believe we're coming to a bit of an event horizon in the next 2 years, especially in the digital channel, potentially in mobile and contactless as well, where fraud is going up so quickly that we are going to have to come to some form of workable digital ID solution, which is going to raise GDPR issues, data protection issues for consumers. And it's this age-old thing, how much are you prepared to give up in exchange for security? But there's no doubt if we look at account takeover, synthetic ID fraud, I think the figure I saw from SIFT was the global rise in synthetic ID fraud was 280%, 19 to 20. So, again, these are from a very low base. The other thing I should say about fraud is that the pandemic has created opportunities for fraudsters in terms of new fraud methods that we had never imagined, like non-receipt of goods and fake invoicing on e-commerce. Now, no one really did that before. I mean, maybe a few people claimed they hadn't received goods and then sold them on, but this has become now its own mini pandemic, commercially speaking, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I also just recently saw something on account takeover is up 20% across Kaspersky's estate. So, I mean, they're a big player in that area, and clearly it's a massive problem. I mean, coming back to that question about the growth in contactless, you and I have been working with a few clients on this. Give us your view on what you think is the solution behind rising contactless levels in terms of the value you can use on a per transaction, and then coupled with the rising opportunity for fraudsters across contactless cards.
So, I mean, there are several different ways of doing it. One of the most promising one looks to be biometric cards, where the fingerprint data is stored on the card, and then the power that energizes the near-field communication circuit is used to confirm the biometric on the card. Obviously, if you're using a mobile device, you can use the biometric scanner on the mobile device. So that looks pretty promising, but it's very early days. And I think it's also a question of consumer comfort. I know that people tell me who live and work in China that people think nothing of sending $15,000 US P2P between mobile phone accounts. But that, again, is because there is a government mandated secure digital ID in place in China. If we move to that in the UK and across Europe, if we feel able to do that and confident to do that, I think it's a game changer. I'm just not sure in the current climate that is something we're going to, as a society, be ready for, quite honestly.
Sure. Okay, James, it's been a pleasure talking to you again. Thank you very much for your insights on the data that you've been working on in the last few years. It's great that that's out now and ready to be purchased, but we really appreciate your insight and analysis on that, and appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.